Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. Today we're exploring whether Canada is experiencing what's known as the Great Resignation and asking whether the nonprofit sector is still seen as a desirable career path, or has burnout in inequitable workplaces caused a large exodus from the sector and high turnover, especially at the leadership level. Joining me today is Veronica Utton. Veronica is a seasoned talent management professional and managing director of V. Utton Associates, providing talent management services to small and mid-sized organizations with a focus in the nonprofit sector and with the goal of fostering and celebrating diverse, inclusive workplaces. Welcome, Veronica, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So we've heard a lot of differences of opinion, and there's been media reports about this as well. But in your opinion and from your experience, is the nonprofit sector in Canada currently facing a Great Resignation?
I really think it depends on who you ask. You know, in a recent article from Human Resource Director, HRD, Home Care Ontario reports having lost 4,000 nurses since the beginning of the pandemic. Many social services in the sector have been successful at maintaining and growing their revenue base. And as a result, they're seeing demand for their services. Charities who have heavily relied on volunteer resources have seen a mass exodus of those resources. Some are reporting up to 75% loss of that talent. The glimmer of hope is in those organizations who are actually maintaining, sustaining, and growing their revenue. They are reporting a positive outlook and will continue to hire to meet the demands of their stakeholders. So it really depends on who you're asking.
Right. And so in the work that you've been doing with the organizations in the past, 2 years, are you seeing a turnover happening at a leadership level in the sector? Why is that happening?
Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, the pandemic has been an accelerator on a number of fronts. And those in that boomer generation who've been thinking about or close to in that 3 to 5 year range of retirement saw it as an opportunity to simply pass the baton to the generation coming up. And so, yeah, we have seen it. And in, again, long-term home care and in the medical side of things, we're certainly seeing the effects in those arenas.
Well, we know the pandemic has had I would say, a disproportionate impact on the nonprofit sector, certainly, and indeed in frontline workers when the demands are so high to them as well, leading to what people are calling a burnout epidemic in the nonprofit sector. Have you seen that? And how is it impacting your area of work with the organizations you deal with?
Well, certainly because we know, over 3/4 of the sector is supported by female workers. And those female workers in the sandwich generation are dealing with it on both ends. They're juggling homeschooling and they're juggling the realities of elder care. And so, in some instances, those individuals are making pretty difficult career choices. But certainly, CAMH is telling us that anxiety and depression is at an all-time high. And so those effects are real. Services are being delayed as a result of lack of capacity inside of organizations. These boomer females who are managing both ends of the spectrum oftentimes find themselves having to scramble for care in a pinch. And so burnout, it's a real thing.
And, I've heard that from other people I've been speaking to that burnout, among other things related to the failure for organizations to roll out effective DEI initiatives and the lack of truly inclusive workplaces is really contributing to this burnout and other sorts of frustrations that is helping, I guess, accelerate or deepen the impact of the Great Resignation. Have you seen that in your work?
Well, certainly when you have organizations who are either unwilling or ill prepared to re-engineer their mindsets along with their policies and their practices. Their biases are real barriers to even considering talent that doesn't quite look like them or sound like them. So when you are leveraging the knowledge and experience that exists in the entirety of the labor talent pool, you're giving yourself an opportunity to actually perhaps fill positions, fill those gaps sooner rather than later when you open up the opportunities to the diverse thinking and perspectives that could be brought into your organization, not only in terms of how you do work, but who you reach. And the markets that you could be potentially opening yourself up to.
Now, could you share some anecdotal experiences that you've had where you've seen, I guess, evidence of the failure of having, effective, equitable, and inclusive workplaces driving the departure of either leaders or their staff? Maybe you could give us some ideas of what you've seen.
Well, certainly I see it on the side of individuals who are just simply trying to get into their career path, and yes, others who are in their career path and have difficulty inside of that workspace. So when we take a look at new immigrants who come to our country with their credentials as doctors, as nurses, as personal support workers, oftentimes they're delayed 3, 4, 5 years in having their credentials validated to Canadian standards. And that leaves a pretty significant gap in the marketplace. And then you have individuals who have experienced the microaggressions, the isolation, and not being able to actually be in that workspace as themselves. And in this period of virtual work, those individuals who have actually experienced psychological safety in their own home offices are actually considering, is it a good thing for me to go back into that workspace? Will I be safe? Will I be able to come as my whole self into that workspace? A lot of individuals I've heard from are considering their options.
So these are people that, would you describe them as equity seeking, underrepresented people or groups of people?
Absolutely. These are the individuals who would be people of color. They might have disabilities. They might have a combination of those identifiers that put them in a disproportionate level.
They're saying basically, I don't want to go back to what I see as an unhealthy or non-inclusive workplace. So I'm thinking of exiting. Is that what they're saying to you?
They're thinking of exiting. They have exited because they recognize that that space no longer serves them.
And what have you seen on the leadership level? We know that, a large majority, at least the statistics show that a large majority of boards skew towards white men. And we know that in the leadership space in the nonprofit sector, men are frequently in the majority. What are you seeing from the perspective of some of these impacts, both in terms of, I guess, the DEI space and the, greater demand for more equitable and inclusive workplaces, as well as the impact of the pandemic on leadership? What do you see is happening there?
Well, certainly there are some organizations who are beginning to recognize the value of diversity inside of their spaces. They see the business benefits if it's not around creating different levels of revenue coming from different pockets of the society. They're seeing opportunity to grow their programs with different perspectives and to serve different stakeholders. And so, for those leaders who see that the change actually has to be a transformation from the inside out of the organization, they're doing the work. They're putting the right policies and practices and simply the forums inside of the organization for individuals to start to speak out and to bring their concerns forward in a way where they feel safe to do that. And so for those leaders, they're stepping up. They're doing the right thing. There are still some organizations, though, who haven't yet been able to see the benefits, and quite frankly, they feel overwhelmed. They don't know where to start in terms of making the changes. They know they need to make changes. They just really don't know where to start in terms of taking that inward look and coming to grips with making and taking one step at a time.
And so, what are those leaders who feel ill-equipped or unprepared? Do you see any sort of decisions on their part? What's happening? What's the phenomenon with them?
Well, I think for some, they recognize that they do need to make a change. They are taking some steps inside of their organizations, even if it is simply to assemble a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee, task force, for them to start the audit process inside, to actually ask themselves, why do we do what we do the way we do it? And is there a different way, a different approach that we could recruit, for instance, that we could actually design our job descriptions, for instance? And so, it simply takes the courage, really, to embrace the fact that you do have systemic concerns inside of your organization. And it's up to you inside of the organization to start to unravel those barriers that are getting in the way of being a more inclusive workspace.
You mentioned earlier when we were chatting that you had seen leaders actually leaving because they felt overwhelmed with that task and didn't feel up to doing this challenging work that's so critical. Maybe you could give us some anecdotes or experiences that you had in your work with these organizations?
Well, and this largely lands with those individuals, those senior leaders who have had a fairly healthy and extensive career. And they're in that boomer generation. They're looking to wind down. And so stepping into the diversity, equity, and inclusion arena takes energy. It takes courage. And it's long haul work. And if you're not up for the long haul work, if you are not as courageous as you once were when you were in your 20s and your 30s, you simply don't have the energy, the staying power that it's going to take to make a substantive impact inside of your workspace. And so it's easier simply to pass the baton than to step into murky waters that you're simply not confident about.
Mm-hmm. So if some of these longtime leaders are resigning or retiring as part of this so-called Great Resignation, is it actually, looking at it from the other perspective, a positive opportunity for renewal and for greater diversity in leadership? Or do you have challenges that concern you?
I think I see it on both sides of the coin. There certainly is opportunity for management to re envision their strategy, their people strategy, together with their organizational strategy. The difficulty is there are not often people in the wings waiting to be moved into those positions. And so we have some work to do in ensuring that individuals who are disproportionately don't have the access to the level of learning that's needed to simply think that we can place a target and then be able to fill those positions is going to be a tricky one until we start to actually build the pipeline of individuals who would be in a position to be either seen as high potentials and then moved into some sort of leadership development program, or simply to be brought into the organization. We first have to mold and give those opportunities to individuals to learn and grow in that level of development. And then, once we have built a strong pipeline, then we're going to be in a better position to have individuals to pass those opportunities off to. So it's a great opportunity, but we certainly have some challenges in filling those gaps.
Right. So it sounds like what you're saying is that for many of these organizations, DEI isn't just about recruitment and creating an inclusive environment, but you literally have to build it into succession planning to see the future come to fruition for a lot of organizations to survive and thrive.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to just move on to another sort of aspect of what we've been learning about in and discussing in the DEI space. In 2018, the federal government passed Bill C-25, which mandated corporations to comply and explain diversity plans to their shareholders. Do you think that this approach, which in the for-profit sector, is the right one for the charitable sector, or do you think there's another approach that would be better?
I would say that it's the right approach in any sector. If you want to create a society that is representative of who it is on the business side, whether it's in the private sector or in the nonprofit sector, you have to have opportunities in which you create space for those individuals to be not only invited, but welcomed to stay. It's one thing to create policies and practices that attract people of color or individuals who may be disabled. But what is the culture like that they are actually going to be stepping into? Is that culture ready to receive them and to sustain them in a way that allows that person to feel as they belong?
And so, what tips would you provide to organizations or to leaders who are heading those organizations that might be struggling with how to adapt to these, the new necessity or the new realization of the necessity for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace, but maybe have limited resources or really don't have the expertise to make it happen? What kind of tips do you have for them?
The reality is, our up and coming millennials, 86% of these individuals are telling us they expect their workspaces to be reflective of what they have grown up in. And so it's not really a matter of if an organization should be doing it, it's when they're going to make the commitment around a DEI strategy. And so at this stage, it's about being intentional about your people strategy. Strategies, in most instances, are consciously created. And so your diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy also has to be consciously created, an intentional approach to shifting and creating a different way of work. Secondly, we know the status quo has been disrupted. The last 2 years has taught us that the status quo gets left behind. And the status quo not only are we talking about flexibility in terms of how individuals will work into the future, but we're also talking about expanding and opening up mindsets, policies, practices in order to attract and sustain a new talent pool that is much more representative of our society.
and the communities that these organizations are actually serving. Really important point. I wanted to ask you on a slightly different sort of aspect about recent legislation. And I'm curious about what your thoughts are about the right to disconnect legislation in Ontario. How much of an impact do you think that will have in protecting staff and organizations from the impacts of burnout or other issues that they might be addressing in the sector and in their workplace?
Certainly a double-edged sword. If you have organizations who currently don't operate with good people practices, this will certainly be a sense of relief to those individuals, those staff who believe they are excessively working overtime. However, if you have individuals inside of organizations who recognize that their performance is tied to upward mobility inside of the organization, these individuals will continue to invest their own time in performing outside of the usual work hours. So, yes, there's an opportunity for some to be protected by this legislation. And then there's an opportunity where those who are driven to success in terms of upward mobility, they will continue to put in the hours, to put in the time, to dedicate themselves to their profession, to their sector, in order to, in their minds, be successful in their career.
So, if you take a step back and look at the big picture now, Veronica, in your experience after the years you spent working with the nonprofit sector, do you think the nonprofit sector is still seen as a meaningful and desirable career choice for both the young candidates or even professionals that might be looking for more meaning in their life and could be doing a sector shift?
Mm. And I think that's the most important word, is the meaning. The last 2 years have had a lot of individuals reevaluate their lives, their purpose, the impact that they're making at work. And so for those individuals, the nonprofit sector will be most attractive because of the intrinsic benefits that an individual will experience. They'll be in a situation, in an environment that allows them to be a part of the greater good, as opposed to the extrinsic benefits like pay and bonuses. So yes, there are some individuals who will be attracted to an organization that offers them the opportunity to have a real and meaningful impact relative to what they might have had in a corporate setting, for instance.
So, if we're looking ahead and we're facing the prospect of Canada perhaps experiencing a great resignation in the nonprofit sector, perhaps we could close with giving you an opportunity to give your best advice to organizations for retaining their staff and attracting new potential candidates in the coming months ahead.
So, if we believe there's a great resignation, there's an opportunity to create a great retention strategy. So, what are you doing to keep people engaged inside of your organization, engaged in the work? Now is the time for managers to be stepping up and demonstrating their care for the individuals that report to them. How aware are they of their own styles and of the needs of their staff? So, for instance, do you have leaders in place who can lead with confidence, who can lead in a time of ambiguity, who can navigate change the way change is forcing us to rethink the way that we work? And are these managers communicating with clarity what their expectations are of their team members and with a dose of empathy? Certainly, we have seen those managers who are actually exercising care with their employees. These are the individuals who are able to hang on, to retain these staff. So if there were two things that I'd suggest that organizations pay attention to, it's their policies and practices. How flexible are they becoming? And certainly, are you creating a workplace that focuses on well-being first?
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.